Please, he's just a dog. He didn't mean any harm. Sarah's voice, usually as soft and steady as the morning tide, cracked with a desperation that cut right through the clinking of crystal glasses and the low, self-important hum of the dining room. But her plea fell on ears made of cold stone and hearts wrapped in silk. In the middle of the marble floor of the Silver Oar, the most expensive restaurant in Blackwood Bay, a small, one-eyed terrier named Pip lay trembling, his ribs aching from the impact of a heavy Italian leather boot. Blackwood Bay is a town of two worlds, separated by a thin veil of salt spray and secrets. There are the crumbling docks where the men smell of diesel and old sea, and then there are the cliffs, the Gold Coast, where the glass-walled mansions stare out at the Atlantic like predatory birds. The air here is always heavy, thick with the scent of brine and the morning wail of distant foghorns. It's a place where the wealthy come to forget their sins and the poor come to bury theirs. Elias Thorne lived in the space between those worlds. At 68 years old, Elias was a ghost in a navy blue coverall. He was the man who mopped the spills no one wanted to see, the man who polished the brass until it reflected the faces of people who never looked back at him. To the patrons of the Silver Oar, he was part of the architecture, as invisible as the oxygen they breathed. He moved with a slight, rhythmic limp, his calloused hands always busy, his eyes always downcast. But behind those tired eyes lay a mind that could map the financial veins of the entire East Coast. 20 years ago, Elias wasn't a janitor. In the smoke-filled backrooms of South Boston, he was known as the architect. He didn't pull triggers, and he didn't sell drugs. He was the man who built empires out of thin air, the one who moved millions through offshore accounts before the internet knew how to track them, the one who settled disputes between titans with a single calculated phone call. He was the brain of the underworld, until the world he built collapsed and took the only thing he ever loved, his daughter. Now his only possessions were a collection of old jazz records that played softly in his studio apartment above a garage, and a heavy steel box bolted to the floorboards under his bed. He had traded power for penance, choosing a life of silence and service. He had sworn never to be that man again. He was content to be a shadow. Hasi sat until the end, because what happens when a shadow is forced back into the light is something you won't want to miss. After you hear this story, tell me in the comments what you would have done in Elias's shoes, and give this story a rating from 0 to 10. If this narrative moves you, please subscribe to the channel to support my work. I'm counting on you. The only bright spot in Elias's grey existence was Sarah. At 24, she was the kind of person who seemed to carry her own light, even though she was drowning in the darkness of reality. She worked double shifts at the restaurant, her feet swollen and her spirit weary, all to pay for the hospice care that kept her mother comfortable in her final days. She was the only person who truly saw Elias. While the elite patrons treated him like furniture, Sarah would bring him a bowl of leftover chowder at the end of a shift, asking about his day with a genuine warmth that reminded him of the daughter he had lost. She had a secret, though. A small, scruffy travel bag tucked away in the staff break room. Inside was Pip. The dog had separation anxiety so severe he would tear his own paws raw if left alone, and Sarah couldn't afford a sitter. So she snuck him in, keeping him quiet with treats and old blankets. Elias knew, of course. He had seen the bag move, heard the tiny whimper, and he had simply looked the other way, occasionally leaving a bit of dried steak near the break room door when no one was looking. But on this particular Tuesday night, the sky over Blackwood Bay had turned the color of a fresh bruise. A violent thunderstorm rolled in off the Atlantic, the kind that made the old timber of the docks groan. Inside the Silver Oar, the atmosphere was different. It was the night of the Sterlings. Julian and Cassandra Sterling were the embodiment of everything Elias had spent 20 years trying to forget. They were new money, loud, entitled, and convinced that their bank account gave them the right to treat the world like a private playground. Julian, a man with a jawline as sharp as his cruelty, sat at table 1, his fourth martini in hand. Cassandra, draped in silk that cost more than Sarah earned in a year, laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, her eyes scanning the room for anyone she could look down upon. Then, a massive crack of thunder shook the very foundation of the building. The power flickered, the chandeliers swaying like hanged men. In the break room, the noise was too much for Pip. The small dog, terrified, managed to nudge the zipper of his bag open. He scrambled out, his tiny paws skidding on the polished floor, as he sought the one person who made him feel safe. He found her in the main dining room, just as she was setting down a tray of appetizers for the Sterlings. Pip whimpered, darting between the legs of the chairs, finally coming to rest near Julian's expensive hand-stitched Italian loafers. Julian didn't just move his foot. He didn't just shoo the animal away. He looked down at the filthy beast with a sneer of pure disgust. Without a second of hesitation, he drew his leg back and delivered a heavy, vicious kick. The sound of the impact, the dull thud of leather against bone, was followed by a sharp, high-pitched yelp that silenced the entire room. Pip skidded across the marble, his small body hitting a decorative pillar before he collapsed, shivering and gasping for air. Sarah screamed. She dropped the tray, the expensive porcelain shattering like ice, and dived for her dog. She gathered Pip into her arms, shielding him with her body as if she expected another blow. "What is wrong with you?" she sobbed, her face pale with shock. "He's just a dog. He's terrified." Julian stood up, towering over her. He didn't look remorseful. He looked insulted. "What is wrong with me? What is wrong with this gutter trash establishment? I am paying $500 for a meal, and I have to deal with a diseased animal touching my clothes." Cassandra leaned back, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. "Honestly, Julian, look at her. She probably brought it in to scavenge for scraps. It's pathetic. The help really needs to learn their place." The restaurant manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, whose spine was made of nothing but a desire for tips, hurried over. He didn't look at the injured dog or the crying waitress. He looked at Julian. "Mr. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry. This is unacceptable. Sarah, you are fired. Get that animal out of here right now, and don't bother coming back for your final check. The damage to the floor and the lost revenue from this disturbance will more than cover it." Sarah looked up, her eyes wide. "But my mother's medicine." "Mr. Henderson, please, it was an accident. The storm—" "I don't care," Julian interrupted, stepping closer to her. He raised a hand not to help her up, but in a threatening gesture, his finger pointing inches from her nose. "If I see you or that rat in this town again, I'll make sure the police handle it. You're lucky I don't sue you for the trauma to my wife." In the shadows of the hallway leading to the kitchen, Elias Thorne stood perfectly still. His hand was wrapped around the handle of a mop bucket, his knuckles white. He watched the scene with a cold, terrifying detachment. He watched Julian's face, the way his nostrils flared with the pheromones of unearned power. He watched Cassandra's mocking smile. But then, Elias's gaze shifted. He looked at Julian's hand. On the man's pinky finger sat a gold signet ring with a unique etched crest, a stylized eagle clutching a key. The air in Elias's lungs suddenly felt like liquid nitrogen. He knew that ring. He knew that crest. It belonged to a private equity firm that had been the primary front for a laundering operation he had designed 32 years ago. He knew where every cent of Julian Sterling's new money came from. He knew the bodies buried in the ledgers, the ghosts hidden in the balance sheets. For 20 years, Elias had been a janitor. He had cleaned up messes with soap and water. But as he watched Sarah crawl toward the exit, clutching her broken dog to her chest, while the wealthy patrons returned to their steaks as if nothing had happened, something inside Elias snapped. The janitor didn't just walk away. He stayed in the shadows, his eyes locked on Julian's back. The limp in his leg seemed to vanish for a moment as he stood straighter. The architect wasn't a man who used guns. He didn't need them. He understood that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a bullet. It's the truth, delivered with surgical precision at the exact moment it can cause the most damage. He watched the Sterlings finish their wine. He watched them leave a $100 tip as if it bought them redemption. And as the heavy oak doors of the Silver Oar closed behind them, Elias let out a long, slow breath. The peace he had sought for 2 decades was a lie. If he allowed men like Julian to walk the earth unopposed, then his daughter's death truly meant nothing. Elias turned and walked toward the back exit. He didn't clock out. He didn't say a word to Mr. Henderson. He walked through the rain, the cold water soaking through his coveralls until he reached his small studio. He didn't turn on the lights. He went straight to the bed and knelt on the floor. His hands, usually trembling with the onset of age, were now as steady as a mountain. He reached under the bed and pulled out the heavy steel box. He felt the cold metal, the weight of a past he had tried to bury. He produced a small silver key from a chain around his neck, the same chain that held a St. Jude medal, the patron saint of lost causes. The lock clicked. It was a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside the box, there were no weapons. There were only papers, encrypted drives, and a burner phone that had been dead for 20 years. Elias picked up the phone. He knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to kill Julian Sterling. Killing was too easy. He was going to erase him. He was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the memory of a man who should have never kicked a dog. But this was only the beginning. Elias knew that once he made the first call, the janitor would be gone forever. He looked at the St. Jude medal in his palm and whispered a name, the name of his daughter. Then he pressed the power button on the burner phone. The screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly blue glow over his weathered face. The architect was back, and the world of Blackwood Bay was about to find out that some ghosts still have teeth. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Sarah whispered into the cold Atlantic wind, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the Blackwood Bay pier. She was sitting on a damp wooden bench, Pip wrapped tightly in her thin denim jacket. The small dog was breathing in shallow, ragged bursts, his one good eye cloudy with pain. Sarah's hands were shaking, not just from the cold rain that had soaked through her clothes, but from the sheer weight of a world that had suddenly decided she didn't deserve to exist in it. But the nightmare was only beginning. While Sarah sat in the dark, wondering how she would pay for Pip's vet bills or her mother's hospice care without a job, Julian Sterling was busy making sure she never had a chance to recover. Back inside the warm, amber-lit sanctuary of the Silver Oar, Julian wasn't satisfied with simply having a waitress fired. To a man like him, an insult from the help was a stain that had to be bleached away with total destruction. Julian pulled a sleek, gold-plated smartphone from his pocket and dialed a number he knew by heart. It wasn't a lawyer or a business partner. It was Chief Miller, the head of the Blackwood Bay Police Department, a man whose mortgage was quietly subsidized by the charitable donations of the Sterling Foundation. "Chief," Julian said, his voice dripping with a false sense of victimhood, "I've just been assaulted at the restaurant. A deranged employee set a vicious animal on me. I want a full report filed. I want the girl in a cell, and I want that mongrel put down before it bites someone else." He hung up with a satisfied smirk, catching Cassandra's eye. She raised her martini glass in a silent toast. To them, Sarah wasn't a human being. She was an inconvenience to be discarded like a chipped plate. They had no idea that every word of that conversation, every sneer and every calculated lie was being recorded by a mind that functioned like a high-speed processor. Elias Thorne was no longer just mopping the floors. He was standing in the shadows of the dry storage room, his ear pressed to the thin wall, his face a mask of ancient, cold fury. In that moment, the 68-year-old janitor with the limp and the tired eyes ceased to exist. The architect had woken up, and when the architect woke up, empires tended to fall. Elias walked back to his small studio apartment, his movements fluid and purposeful. The rain didn't seem to touch him anymore. He felt a familiar coldness settling into his bones, the kind of coldness that comes when a man realizes that his pursuit of peace was nothing more than a coward's retreat. For 20 years, he had blamed himself for his daughter Maya's death. He had thought that by vanishing, by becoming a ghost, he was protecting the world from the monster he used to be. But as he looked at the steel box under his bed, he realized that some monsters are necessary to keep the wolves at bay. He sat on the edge of his narrow cot and opened the box. The blue light from the burner phone illuminated the deep lines of his face. He stared at the screen for a long time. He remembered the last time he had used his influence. It had been to settle a trade war in the Mediterranean that threatened to destabilize 3 different currencies. Now he was going to use that same influence to protect a girl and a dog. To some, it would seem like a waste of resources. To Elias, it was the only thing that mattered. He made the first call. It was to a man in New York known only as the Tailor. He was a retired cleaner, someone who specialized in finding the threads of a person's life and pulling them until everything unraveled. "It's been a long time, architect," the voice on the other end whispered, sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I thought you were under the sea." "I was," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that hadn't been heard in decades. "But the tide has changed. I need everything on Julian and Cassandra Sterling, not just the public records. I want the offshore accounts, the mistress in Connecticut, the tax shelters in the Caymans, and the exact origin of the seed money for Sterling Global. Start with the Eagle and Key signet ring. You'll find my signature on the original paperwork." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. If that's where the money came from, Julian is playing with fire and doesn't even know he's standing in a pool of gasoline. "I want him to feel the heat before he sees the flame," Elias said, and hung up. The second call went to a high-ranking official in the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington, D.C., a man who, 20 years ago, had been a mid-level clerk caught in a gambling debt that would have ended his career and his life. Elias had made the debt vanish. Now it was time to collect the interest. "Elias?" the official gasped, his voice trembling. "I was told you were dead. I saw the funeral report." "Reports can be edited," Elias replied coldly. "Listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, an anonymous tip will reach your desk regarding Sterling Global. It will contain evidence of a massive pump-and-dump scheme involving green energy tech. You won't ignore it. You will freeze their domestic assets for investigative purposes. You have 12 hours. "Elias, that's a massive move. I could lose my job." "You'll lose much more if you don't," Elias interrupted. "Remember the ledger in Zurich. I still have the original." The line went dead. The third and final call was the hardest. It was to a man named Marcus, the head of a private security firm that handled the protection of heads of state and tech billionaires. Marcus had been Elias's protégé, the man he had trained to see the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of tactical vulnerabilities. "Is it time?" Marcus asked, not even waiting for a greeting. He had been waiting for this call for 20 years. "Not for a war," Elias said, his eyes softening as he looked at a faded photograph of his daughter tucked into the lid of the steel box. "For a shield. I need a house in Blackwood Bay watched, a girl named Sarah. She's being targeted by the local police. If a cruiser pulls into her driveway, I want your team to intervene. No casualties, but make it clear that she is under the protection of someone they cannot afford to cross. And Marcus, send a veterinarian to her door. A good one. Tell him he's working for a ghost." As he tucked the phone away, Elias felt a strange sense of lightness. The guilt that had weighed him down for 2 decades hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into a singular, sharp purpose. He was a man who had designed the shadows of the world, and now he was going to use those shadows to create a sanctuary. But he knew he couldn't just work from the dark. He had to see the damage for himself. He had to ensure Sarah knew she wasn't alone, even if she didn't know who was watching over her. Later that night, Sarah was startled by a soft knock on her door. She lived in a tiny, weathered cottage on the edge of the marshes, a place where the floorboards groaned and the salt air ate at the paint. She clutched Pip to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought it was the police. She thought Chief Miller had finally come to take her dog away. She opened the door just a crack, the chain still engaged. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the rain still falling in a steady, rhythmic pulse. But sitting on the welcome mat was a small, plain envelope and a glint of silver. Sarah knelt down, her breath hitching. She picked up the object. It was a heavy silver St. Jude medal on a sturdy chain, the patron saint of lost causes. Beneath it, the envelope contained enough cash to cover her mother's hospice for 3 months, and a handwritten note in precise, elegant script. "The storm is passing. Hold on to the light." She looked out into the darkness of the street, but all she saw was the flicker of a distant street lamp and the silhouette of a man walking away with a slight, rhythmic limp. She didn't know his name was Elias Thorne. She didn't know he was a man who had once held the fate of cities in his hands. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, the world didn't feel like it was trying to crush her. But while Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, the Sterlings were about to feel the first cracks in their gilded cage. They had no idea that the invisible man who mopped their spills was currently dismantling the very ground they stood on. Every dollar they spent, every lie they told, and every life they stepped on was being turned into a weapon. And as the sun began to rise over the grey waters of Blackwood Bay, the first reports of a financial irregularity at Sterling Global began to hit the news wires. The architect was no longer just watching. He was building a masterpiece of retribution. What would you do if you discovered that your entire life was built on a foundation of secrets that a ghost could shatter with a single phone call? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to give this part of the story a rating. If you're as gripped by Elias's journey as I am, make sure you're subscribed. The real dismantling is just about to begin. The fluorescent lights of the emergency veterinary clinic hummed with a sterile, uncaring vibration that seemed to drill into Sarah's skull. She sat on a plastic chair that felt like ice, her eyes fixed on the double doors where a young technician had disappeared with Pip nearly an hour ago. Every time the door swung open, her heart leaped into her throat, only to sink back into a cold pool of dread when it wasn't news about her dog. She looked down at her hands. They were stained with a mixture of rainwater and the faint copper scent of Pip's blood. But the financial reality was a different kind of pain. Sarah clutched her purse, knowing exactly how much was in her bank account, $242. It was supposed to cover her mother's specialized meal supplements and the bus pass that got her to the restaurant. She knew a surgery, or even a basic emergency exam, would cost 3 times that. The weight of her helplessness was a physical thing, a phantom hand around her neck, squeezing tighter with every tick of the clock. Then, the doors opened. A man in a white coat, his face weary but kind, walked toward her. This was Dr. Aris, a specialist who usually dealt with the high-priced thoroughbreds and purebred hounds of the Gold Coast. Sarah stood up, her legs wobbling. Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Aris smiled, though there was a strange, questioning look in his eyes. "Pip is a fighter. He has 2 cracked ribs and some internal bruising, but remarkably no permanent damage to his organs. We've stabilized him, given him something for the pain, and he's resting comfortably." Sarah let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the moment Julian Sterling's boot connected with her dog. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I need to talk about the bill. I don't have much right now, but I can set up a payment plan. I can work extra hours. I can—" The doctor held up a hand, silencing her. "There's no need for that, Sarah. The bill has been settled, in full." Sarah blinked, her mind refusing to process the words. "Settled? By who? I don't understand." "The benefactor," Dr. Aris said, leaning against the reception desk. "A man called about 20 minutes ago. He didn't give a name, but he spoke with an authority that didn't leave room for questions. He also mentioned that a private nurse would be arriving at your mother's hospice tomorrow morning to oversee her transition to a more advanced care wing, all expenses covered." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah felt as though she were walking through a dream, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Who would do this? She had no rich relatives, no secret admirers. The only person who had even looked at her with kindness in months was the quiet janitor at work, but he was just an old man with a mop. Or was he? But as Sarah left the clinic, the sense of relief was shattered by the sight of a Blackwood Bay police cruiser idling at the curb. The blue and red lights weren't flashing, but the presence was unmistakable. Chief Miller was sitting in the driver's seat, his window rolled down, a toothpick dancing between his lips. "Sarah Jenkins," he called out, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "Step over to the car." Sarah felt the cold grip of fear return. She walked toward the cruiser, her hands shaking. "Chief, is something wrong?" "Mr. Sterling filed a formal complaint," Miller said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "Claimed your animal attacked him. Claimed you threatened him when he tried to defend himself. I've got a warrant here for the seizure of the animal for evaluation and a summons for you to appear at the precinct for questioning regarding an assault charge." "That's a lie," Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "He kicked Pip. There were witnesses." "The witnesses I spoke to, the manager and the patrons, all seemed to remember it differently," Miller replied, finally turning his head to look at her with eyes that were as hollow as a shallow grave. "Now give me the dog." But before Sarah could speak, a second vehicle pulled up behind the cruiser. It was a black SUV with tinted windows, moving with a silent, predatory grace. 4 men in dark, well-tailored suits stepped out. They didn't look like police, and they certainly didn't look like locals. They moved with the synchronized precision of elite soldiers. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, walked directly up to Chief Miller's window. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply leaned down and showed the chief a small, laminated card. "Chief Miller?" the man said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished glass. "My name is Marcus. I represent a private security interest that has taken a sudden and profound interest in the welfare of Ms. Jenkins and her property. I've just received word that the State Attorney's Office is currently reviewing a series of interesting financial transactions involving your personal bank accounts and the Sterling Foundation. I suggest you put that toothpick away and drive back to your station, now." Miller's face went from a smug, arrogant red to a sickly, pale grey in a matter of seconds. He looked at the card, then at the men standing like statues around his car, and then back at Marcus. Without a word, he rolled up his window and sped away, his tires screeching on the wet pavement. Sarah stood frozen, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Marcus turned to her and gave a stiff, respectful nod. "Ms. Jenkins, you're safe. We'll be staying nearby. Go home, get some sleep. The architect sends his regards." "Who is the architect?" Sarah whispered. But Marcus had already turned away, his team melting back into the shadows of the SUV. While Sarah was being shielded by a power she didn't understand, the Sterlings were beginning to realize that their gilded world was rotting from the inside out. Julian Sterling stood in his glass-walled office, staring at a computer screen that showed a single devastating word in red letters: frozen. Every domestic account, every credit line, every penny of the new money he used to bully the world had been locked down by the SEC. He had spent the last 3 hours on the phone with his lawyers, but for the first time in his life, his money couldn't buy him an answer. They spoke of irregularities, of anonymous whistleblowers, and of a ledger that shouldn't exist. "Julian, what is happening?" Cassandra's voice was high and brittle. She was standing in the doorway, her phone in her hand, her face white. "My guest list for the Save the Coast Gala, half of them just cancelled. The Waldorf Astoria in New York just called to say our penthouse reservation has been reassigned due to a booking error. And the press, Julian, someone leaked the court records from my time in Florida. The embezzlement charges, everything." Julian turned, his face contorted with a rage that was beginning to smell like panic. "Someone is doing this. Someone is targeting us. It's that waitress. She must have a lawyer or some—" "A waitress?" Cassandra spat, her eyes wide with terror. "Julian, look at the precision. This isn't a waitress. This is a demolition. We're being erased." In the middle of their crumbling empire, Julian remembered the janitor. He remembered the old man mopping the floor, the man he had stepped over as if he were a pile of trash. He remembered the moment he had kicked the dog, and how for a split second he had caught the janitor's eye. It had been a gaze of such profound, ancient coldness that it had made the hair on the back of Julian's neck stand up. But he had dismissed it. He had thought the man was a nobody. But Julian Sterling had no idea that the nobody was currently sitting in a dark studio apartment, looking at a bespoke charcoal suit that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years. Elias Thorne ran his fingers over the fine wool of the jacket. He felt the weight of the man he used to be. For 2 decades he had hidden from this person. He had hated the architect. He had blamed the architect for the stray bullet that had found his daughter in a restaurant, much like the silver ore. He had thought that by mopping floors, he was washing the blood from his hands. But as he looked at the silver St. Jude medal he had kept for Sarah, he realized that he couldn't be a janitor anymore. A janitor cleans up the mess after it's been made. An architect ensures the structure never falls in the first place. He put on the suit. It fit him like armor. He looked at himself in the small, cracked mirror above his sink. The tired eyes were gone. In their place was a clarity that would have terrified anyone who knew the history of the South Boston underworld. He looked at the clock. The Save the Coast Gala was starting in 2 hours. It was the biggest social event in Blackwood Bay, the place where the Sterlings intended to cement their status as the town's new royalty. Elias picked up his burner phone and made one last call. "Marcus, are the files ready?" "Ready and waiting, architect," the voice replied. "The ballroom is secured, the guests are arriving, the Sterlings are there, trying to act like their world isn't on fire." "Good," Elias said, his voice a low, steady hum. "It's time to show them that in Blackwood Bay the tide doesn't just go out, it comes back in, and it brings everything you tried to bury back to the surface." He walked out of the apartment, his limp barely noticeable now, his stride purposeful. He wasn't going to the gala to reclaim his power. He was going there to finish a job. He was going to ensure that Sarah and Pip would never have to be afraid again. But as Elias stepped into the rain, a single thought crossed his mind. He knew that by stepping back into the light, he was ending his own peace. He was inviting the ghosts of his past to find him. But for the first time in 20 years, he didn't care. He had spent a lifetime building things for the wrong people. Tonight he was going to tear something down for the right reasons. What happens when a man who has lost everything decides he has nothing left to fear? Tell me in the comments what you think the architect has planned for the Sterlings. Does Julian deserve what's coming, or has Elias gone too far? Give this part of the story a rating and make sure you're here for the final confrontation. The gala is about to begin, and the guest of honor hasn't even arrived yet. The silver ore was ablaze with light, a shimmering jewel perched on the dark, jagged cliffs of Blackwood Bay. Inside, the Save the Coast gala was in full swing, but the air felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out of the room by an invisible vacuum. The elite of Massachusetts moved in tight, nervous circles, whispering about the sudden financial collapse of Sterling Global. Julian Sterling stood near the bar, his tuxedo slightly disheveled, his face flushed with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Cassandra was beside him, her forced smile looking more like a grimace of pain as she clutched a champagne flute so hard her knuckles were white. "Where is Henderson?" Julian snarled, his voice carrying over the string quartet. "I want the manager. I want to know who let those people into my accounts. I want to know why the police haven't arrested that waitress yet." "Mr. Sterling," a voice called out from the center of the ballroom. It wasn't a loud voice. It didn't need to be. It was a voice that carried the weight of ancient stone, a low, melodic baritone that silenced the room instantly. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and there, standing under the massive crystal chandelier, was a man they didn't recognize. And yet, the oldest men in the room, the ones with real power, felt a cold shiver of recognition. Elias Thorne didn't look like a janitor. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His white hair was neatly swept back, and his posture was as straight as a blade. The slight limp was gone, replaced by a measured, predatory grace. He stood in the center of the floor, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Julian with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. "Who the hell are you?" Julian demanded, taking a stumbling step forward. "This is a private event. Security, get this man out of here." But the security guards, Marcus's men who had quietly replaced the restaurant's staff an hour earlier, didn't move. They stood like statues at the exits, their eyes fixed on Elias. "You should be careful what you wish for, Julian," Elias said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You spent the last 48 hours asking for the man who ruined you. Well, I'm here, but I think you've forgotten your manners. You haven't apologized to Sarah yet." Julian's eyes widened. He looked at the suit, the confidence, the sheer presence of the man before him. Then his gaze fell on Elias's hand, where a heavy silver signet ring sat on his finger, a ring Julian recognized from his own firm's historical archives. It was the original Eagle and Key. "You!" Julian whispered, the color draining from his face until he was the shade of old parchment. "You're the architect, but you're the janitor. You mop the floors. You clean the toilets." "I clean up messes, Julian. That has always been my job," Elias replied calmly. He took a slow step toward the younger man. 30 years ago I designed the foundation your father built his fortune on. I built the labyrinths you used to hide your greed. And because I built them, I know exactly which brick to pull to make the whole thing come crashing down." Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a sworn confession. It details the false police report you filed against Sarah Jenkins. It admits that you intentionally harmed a defenseless animal, and used your influence to corrupt a public official. And here," he held up a small encrypted tablet, "is the digital trail of the $5 million you embezzled from the very charity this gala is supposed to support." Cassandra gasped, her glass finally shattering on the marble floor. The socialites around them drew back in horror, their faces twisted in disgust, as the truth began to circulate through the room like a virus. "You have two choices, Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that only the Sterlings could hear. "You can sign this confession, authorize a $3 million settlement into a trust for Sarah and her mother, and leave Blackwood Bay tonight. You will go to the authorities, you will surrender your passport, and you will never speak that girl's name again." Julian tried to summon his old arrogance, his chest heaving. "And if I don't? You're an old man, Thorne. You're a ghost. You have no standing here." Elias leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto Julian's with a ferocity that made the younger man flinch. "If you don't, I will stop being a janitor. I will become the architect again. And I promise you, by sunrise, you won't just be poor, you will be a memory. I will dismantle your name so thoroughly that even the internet will forget you ever existed. I will find every person you have ever cheated, every life you have ever stepped on, and I will give them your address, do you understand?" For a long minute, the only sound in the ballroom was the ticking of a grandfather clock. Julian looked around at the faces of his peers, the people he had tried so hard to impress. They were looking at him as if he were a leper. He looked at Elias, and for the first time in his life he saw the abyss. He saw a man who had nothing to lose, because he had already lost everything that mattered. Julian's hand shook as he reached for the pen Elias offered. He signed the paper. "The trust is already active," Elias said, taking the paper back. "Marcus will escort you to your home to pack your things. You have 1 hour to clear the city limits." As the Sterlings were led out of the ballroom in total humiliating silence, Elias stood alone in the center of the room. He felt the eyes of the wealthy and powerful on him, waiting for a speech, waiting for a sign of who would take the Sterlings' place. But Elias didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked toward the back of the restaurant, toward the kitchen and the mop buckets, and out into the cool night air. The resolution of the storm was quiet. A week later, Sarah Jenkins received a call from a law firm in Boston. She was told that an anonymous trust had been established in her name, a fund so large it would not only pay for her mother's care for the rest of her life, but would allow Sarah to never work another double shift again. But Sarah didn't buy a mansion on the cliffs. Instead, she stayed in her small cottage and bought the old abandoned warehouse near the docks. She spent the next year turning it into Thorne's Refuge, a state-of-the-art no-kill animal shelter. Pip, fully recovered and wearing a new leather collar, became the shelter's official mascot, greeting every stray with a wag of his tail. Sarah often looked for the quiet janitor to thank him, but Elias Thorne had vanished from Blackwood Bay as if he had never existed. The final scene of our story takes place on a long, fog-shrouded pier at the edge of the Atlantic. Elias Thorne sat on a weathered bench, his navy coveralls back on, though they were clean and pressed. The sun was just beginning to break through the grey clouds, casting a golden path across the water. He held the burner phone in his calloused hand. It had served its purpose. He had stepped back into the world of shadows to save a piece of the light, and now he was ready to return to the silence. He stood up, his limp gone, his heart finally feeling a little less heavy. He looked at the saint. Jude medal he still wore around his neck, the saint of lost causes. He realized then that he wasn't a lost cause. He was a man who had finally found his way home. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the burner phone into the deep, dark water. He watched it sink, the small ripples disappearing into the vastness of the ocean. True power, Elias realized, isn't found in a signet ring or a bank account. It isn't found in the ability to destroy. It's found in the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of the cost to your own safety. He turned and walked away from the pier, disappearing into the morning mist. Some lions don't need to roar to be feared. They don't need to show their claws to be respected. They just need to watch and wait and act when the world forgets that even the most invisible among us can hold the power to change everything. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that justice should always find a way, please subscribe to the channel. I promise to bring you more stories of those who fight in the shadows to protect the light. And please leave a comment below and give this story a rating from 0 to 10. I read every single one of your thoughts. Until next time, remember, be kind to the invisible, for you never know who is truly watching.